Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh, everyone. Welcome to the very first episode of the Miri Piri Project. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a second to explain to you exactly what the Miri Piri Project is and what it is we're trying to work to do. So we noticed that the state of online Sikh discourse was often very toxic in nature, focusing on petty disagreements rather than broader Panthic issues. So we wanted to make a space where we could have good faith Sikh conversations that focus on those broader issues and deeper philosophical and ideological disagreements rather than just simple fights. So this isn't going to be a space for loud arguments or big fights. It's going to be a space for productive and constructive conversation. And we hope that in the comments and online, we can continue to have that conversation and hopefully we can spark a broader Panthic discussion. So thank you all for watching, and I really hope that you enjoy the first episode of the Miri Piri Project. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome everybody to the very first episode of the Miri Piri Project, where we work to have good faith discussions about various Panthic topics. I'm very privileged and very honored to introduce our guest today. First, we have Karanveer Pannu, who has worked with the likes of New Jersey Attorney General Gurpreet Garwal and recent presidential candidate Cory Booker. We also have with us today Karam Singh, co-founder of the California Sikh Youth Association and former staffer of the U.S. House of Foreign Affairs Committee. And finally, we have Shamsher Singh, co-founder of the National Sikh Youth Federation and prominent Sikh activist. Thank you all for joining us today. The topic they'll be discussing today is, should we as Sikhs engage in electoral politics, so things like voting and running for public office, etc. The structure of the discussion will be opening statements where they'll define their positions, about an hour of open dialogue, and then closing statements. I'll be serving the role as a moderator, but so as to let the conversation speak for itself, I'm going to be relatively hands-off, only getting involved if there's a miscommunication or things start to get heated. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with opening statements. So, Karanveer Pannu, if you want to go first.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you, Juptej, for making this happen. I think creating an atmosphere that promotes civil discussion is critical in uniting us as a bunch. I'm excited to be here with both Karam and Shamsher, who are doing awesome things in their own ways to uplift the community. And I think that's what the goal should always be. So personally, I feel that the beauty of Sikhi is that anyone can draw different interpretations and reflections that motivates them to continue striving to be the best Sikh they can be. So in my own life, I look at the concept of Miri Piri, that we're always trying to work towards achieving a state of serenity and freedom, that both in our personal lives and in our own spiritual lives. So to me, what that means is that the concept of balancing spirituality with political authority. So that's always inspired me to do what I've done in my own life. So should we be engaged in the political process? Absolutely. I can assure you that if I hadn't interned with Sullivan Greenwald here in New Jersey, we wouldn't have been able to draft the bill that I drafted to make April of every year in New Jersey Sikh Awareness and Appreciation Month. So granted, there are many ways to go about fighting for Sikh causes and issues, but I strongly believe that being engaged politically is one of those avenues we can help raise awareness of Sikhi, but also work towards fighting for Sikh causes. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Next up, we can do Karam Singh with his opening statement.
Sure. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, everyone. I have similar sentiments to what Karanveer just said. I think advocacy and participation within sort of the electoral political system can improve sort of the material conditions of our communities. I think we have a long way to go until we get authentic Sikh leaders who put the Sikh community first. I think historically, we've done a bad job, and especially Sikh representation. I think it was representation sort of devoid of any actual causes or devoid of actual representation when it comes to what the community wanted. It was more of just a representation of just face value of having a Sikh or the Tari Singh up there in government, and we thought that was enough for us. But I think as sort of Canadian politics and other sort of histories that we can learn from is that Sikh candidates, Sikh representatives who do not put the issues of our community first should be voted out. I think we can improve the material conditions of our communities if we participate in a way in which we put our communities first. And I think that's really important. And I think it all starts from the local and regional level. I think we like to get drawn out sort of to the national conversation about, what party is doing this and what they aren't doing. But I think on the local and regional level, we have to be involved in order to continue our continue our presence in terms of as a community. It's little things like school choice, for example, or there are in my area there's a local uh, uh, Sikh Punjabi school that's K through eighth grade, and school choice is a huge issue. We believe in charter schools. We believe in having the right to educate our own communities and families choosing what is being taught to our children, right? So these are integral sort of issues that the community cares about, and we feel like, or certainly I feel like, the only way we can do this is by being involved in the electoral process and putting our communities first, but also helping communities that need us, right? So I think both can happen. I think there's obviously compromises that are made, but I think we can move forward to help our communities, and I think it's important for us to be involved and continue Sikh advocacy in a very unapologetic way. I think our elders, our parents were scared to bring some of these issues to the forefront, but I think now that there isn't a language barrier, I think we've torn down some barriers we have into accessing these institutions. I think there is no excuse for us to be unapologetic about our Sikh issues and be involved in the electoral process.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. Next up, we have Shamsher Singh with his opening statement.
Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. As you've heard from our siblings, they argue that without participation in electoral politics, Sikhs cannot be counted, cannot be visible or represented. They've gone a little bit further as well, talking about ideas of justice, and perhaps we talk about Sikh genocide, and these speak to deeply held Sikh desires for freedom and sovereignty. With Satguru's Agya, I hope in this short time I can shed light on these politics and reveal their true nature and talk about an alternative. And to give it the correct name, participation in electoral politics means participation in colonial systems of oppression and occupation, that maintain white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal values. And they rely on a number of assumptions, that if we take state power, we can affect social change. I don't think Sikhs that participate in electoral politics make the grand claim of taking state power. It's always about representation and being accountable or visible within an existing system, a white supremacist capitalist system of power. And these assumptions often are unstated. They're presented as compromises. I think it's important that we be explicit about these assumptions. Voting doesn't affect societal change. Voting doesn't bestow rights. And the Sikh model throughout our entire history hasn't been to participate in systems of oppression, but to capture political power and impact change directly. So we talk about Miri Piri. Miri Piri exists outside of the domination of any other authority. Miri Piri as a value cannot be enacted within a system of oppression and occupation where you have another sovereignty or another power above you. Then it basically becomes like liberalism, devoid of value, devoid of deeper meaning and substance, and just becomes a rhetorical talking point or symbolism. And if we want to talk about Sikhs in electoral politics, that by participating in electoral politics, we erase and conflate and restrict the definition of political engagement to electoral politics. And Sikhi teaches us that there is far more praxis and far more political engagement, activism, whatever you want to call it, outside of those systems. And for me, that's the type of politics that I'm most interested in, because there I'm not being forced to restrict myself or the desires of our people to a system that inherently seeks to oppress us and control us. And also these conversations of Sikh involvement within politics completely ignore Punjab and its realities. But within Punjab, since we've entered into this post-1947 world, as some of my colleagues will talk about, within this post-1947 world, we've had Sikh participation in the highest levels of the political kid or the arena within Punjab. So we've had Sikh presidents and we've had Sikh chief ministers in Punjab. that hasn't resulted in any effective material change. In fact, the Sikh political elite, the bourgeoisie that have been part of the political process and the political system, have always stood to oppress the Sikh community. Any change that we have for our rights, for our existence, for our education, the structures have come outside of the restrictions of electoral politics. So when we're talking about educating ourselves, we cannot ignore the impact that the communities had. I've grown up in a country without political representation. I'm aware and I'm educated because of the knowledge that exists within the community. What I've seen in my short period of time is Sikhs that enter into the political arena, they erase, restrict, distort Sikh realities to fit into definitions imposed upon us by white supremacy.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. So now we're just going to open up the floor for discussion, and I'm just going to mute myself and sit back and allow it to happen. So whoever wants to start that discussion, now's the.
Yeah, so I think we disagree on a few points. I think first is what does participation mean inside of a system? I think to some extent, I think we all participate in sort of marginalizing folks in I think just in reality, I think we participate in some sort of way to marginalize other folks, whether it be like through this, Discord or Zoom call today. I think even any sort of consumption we have has consequences, and I think that's the reality of the world. So I don't think we should navigate it in a way that's black and white. I think we have to be strategic. I think I think it's ahistorical to say that Sikhs only participated in a completely black and white way. I think even post 84, there was authentic Sikh electoral politics which happened, up until the election of 1891, where 13 pro-independence candidates won in the general election. So I think there was participation. I think Sikhs, obviously now have lost their faith in the system, but I think there is faith in the system to improve conditions of people. I think whether it be Sikh advocacy in the United States, I think it is historical to say that communities who have lobbied, who have done advocacy, were able to improve their conditions or even foreign policy with particular states. I think Gurmeet Singh Olak is a perfect example of this. So many different, we can talk about the resolutions or the stuff he got into the congressional record, and I think for some people that might be meaningless, but the fact of the matter is that there was conversations happening that are documented that they were around sanctioning the government of India, right? So the advocacy was so strong, and there was so much faith in the system to the extent that Republican Congressman Dan Burton and others were having conversations around sanctioning India and improving the conditions of the Kharagpur Jathebandiyan that are happening in Punjab by sanctioning the Indian government. So these are very real steps that I think Sikh advocates need to be unapologetic in supporting, and I think this is the time to do so. I think we are given the tools to change the layout of sort of the global makeup. We are voters. I think we do expend some of our sovereignty by paying taxes, and I think we should use that to our benefit, because at the end of the day, when we expend our sovereignty to pay taxes, I think we should expect something in return, and I think in return, we're given the right to do advocacy in the way that we see fit. So I think there are channels in which we can improve the material conditions. I think we have to be strategic at the end of the day in terms of fitting in, and I think changing our language to what you would call to fit in or to appease white supremacy. I think when you interact with any other community, I think the language you use is always sort of circumstantial. So I think I don't think too deeply into that. As long as the Sikh conscious reflects these needs, I think sort of Sikh bureaucrats and people in political leadership, it is their duty to sometimes explain these movements in words that are palatable and can improve the material conditions of our people, right? So I don't think too deeply into that. I think when we start using some of this language to teach our own communities how to think about the Sangharsh, I think that's problematic. But I think when we move forward in a strategic way to engage these politicians about our issues, I think, just like any other community, we have to be strategic. We have to maneuver ourselves in a way that doesn't hurt us. So, and I think most people who end up doing this, Gurmeet Singh Olak included, have very good intentions of helping people. And their project and their work have shown that it is possible to organize and advocate in a way that we can really do some damage and we can really help our community.
I mean, I think it's important when we talk about participation within electoral politics that we don't restrict Sikh political advocacy to electoral politics. I think that's something that we can all agree on, that there is a mode and method of political engagement or furthering our goals as a people that doesn't restrict us to, participating within electoral politics. I think when we do talk about electoral politics, I think it's incredibly important to talk about outcomes. And because the outcome is where the rhetoric and the claims of being strategic are actually tested. I don't think it's black and white, definitely. I think what electoral politics does is restrict the conversation to being black and white. I think it's far more nuanced. There's far more discussion that needs to happen outside of the restrictive paradigm of electoral politics. And the thing is, we've seen this happen, for decades and decades and decades, and the outcomes have been mediocre. We can talk about representing Kharkus that are physically fighting and engaging in a guerrilla warfare, so that white supremacy, the states of whiteness sees them. But we haven't been able to achieve that as an outcome. The state, whether it's America, whether it's Britain, whichever state it is, they still define Sikh resistance as terrorism. Sikh Jujaru Jathebandiyan that we acknowledge as shaheeds and martyrs, those Jujaru Jathebandiyan are prescribed and banned as terrorist organizations. So when we're entering into this arena, what we're seeking, is the question. And a lot of the times, Sikh political advocacy completely sidesteps any material discussion. And Sikh political advocacy emerges out of the need of the Sikh people to have their sangarsh and their resistance talked about. Not just for civil rights issues. Civil rights issues are important, and again, the civil rights issues aren't resolved through voting; they're resolved through agitations. Take the UK for example. The law changes around the resistance the Sikh community puts up. So when our Dastar was on the verge of being banned, Sikhs couldn't ride motorcycles without wearing their Dastar. There was agitations that allowed the law to be changed. That the law had to change, otherwise, there's going to be too much social upset. So I think sometimes we put this idea that voting is harm reduction, participating in electoral politics is harm reduction, and I think it's a flawed argument because it takes away from our entire history. If we were going to change the system by participation, then Guru Nanak Sahib should have stuck to the job he had, and by the time we got to Guru Gobind Singh, maybe we would have had a Sikh sitting on the Mughal throne. It takes too long. I've seen documents from before I was born that put the Sikh case in the Houses of Parliament in Britain. The material condition hasn't changed. We've got a Dastar wearing Sikh MP in the Houses of Parliament in the UK. Sikh kids are still getting bullied for their Dastar in schools all across the diaspora. So the material condition doesn't change. It doesn't matter how visible we are within the system of electoral politics. The change always comes from grassroots activism and advocacy.
So I just had a quick question, Shamsher. So when you say you agitated and then you got the laws to benefit the Sikh community in the UK, so wouldn't you say that by agitating you were engaging in the political process to get the law to support the community there?
Yeah, definitely. We're engaging in the political process on our terms, right? So the political process was limited, and the law said you can't wear a dastar and ride a motorcycle. You can't have a kirpan. And by exposing the limitations of that system, by forcing it to acknowledge that Sikhs want to exist in a different way, the laws had to then change to reflect Sikh reality. and that didn't rely upon Sikhs voting for that change. That relied upon protesting. That relied upon, you know.
So that's just one form of engaging in the political process. There's voting, there's protesting the government. So there's different avenues that Sikhs can take to kind of have the presence shown and known in the community. So I think that's the Kirpan issue is one I'm passionate about here as well, because unlike the UK and Canada and America, it's not the same. So it's something that we have to fight for here in America. And I think by engaging in the political process, that's one way we're going to get the laws to change here, and also by protesting, like you mentioned.
Yeah, no, I agree that I think we need to have a very diverse coalition of people that are pushing for Sikh rights. That includes within the bureaucracies, within people. I think it has to be good-minded and people that are unapologetically Sikh. It has to be them. I think anyone who tries to appease or tries to that shy away from being unapologetic in what they believe in, I think we don't need those people in government. I think, like Shamsher Singh, you mentioned, like, you know, you have Sikh MPs, and we've had people who've claimed to support us. And I think what I try to do in the limited work we do here is that we have to make sure that we hold people accountable, and it's not. And I think that gets forgotten. I think people show up to like Vaisakhi Melas and that's it, and then we don't hold people accountable. I think we have to have it by issue, right? Because there's no point in being involved if it's just. And I hate sort of resolutions too. I don't think they get anything done. I think there is some sort of visibility there. Sure, like maybe six more people know about Sikhs. There could be some improvement there, but at the end of the day, the resolutions don't get anything done. We have to have clear-cut issues, right? So I think, for example, like Sikhs in ICE detention facilities, right? They don't have the right to wear the stars, right? So this is a Sikh issue, and I think it would be a disservice to us to say, hey, we're not gonna lobby, we're not gonna vote, we're not gonna go into politics and try to change these things, right? So I think there's different interpretations to how we get involved, and I think that's perfectly and completely okay for there to be multiple interpretations, because at the end of the day, I think we all need to work towards securing Sikh issues, and I think it can come. There's a vast array along the spectrum in which Sikhs belong to. I come from sort of a valley community that is very sort of center right, you know, in the way that they operate. They're agricultural. They believe certain parties protect their agricultural interests more. They're people who believe in the Second Amendment fundamentally. They think it's that sort of right as an American has resonance with their right to carry a kirpan. It might not be one exactly the same, but I think those rights have resonance with each other. So they find value in supporting that, right? So there's a vast array of issues. You know, I know a lot of Sikhs who are very libertarian, who believe in a model in which of limited government. They believe in sort of having the right to carry the arms that they wish, and this is a very sort of sovereign mindset they have. And some of this puts them in the camp of people that what some would call socially unacceptable, right? So I think there's a vast array along the spectrum. And I think what I've noticed, especially in Sikh circles and I think young people engaging across college campuses, is that people have started to box in people and saying that Sikhs have to think a particular way. I think that Sikh sovereignty, there isn't one sort of medium in terms of expressing it. I know Sikhs who are hardcore libertarians who believe they are the true expression of Sikh sovereignty, as they believe in limited government, they believe in the right to carry arms. They have some very sort of fundamental resonance that they have with those organizations or those parties, right? And I believe they are truly expressing the way they see Sikhi and they see Sikh sovereignty. So I think what's unfortunate is I think this dogma that's being created on, for example, college campuses, in which Sikhs are thinking a certain way. I think they're buying into a particular ideology and they're putting on the blinders, and they're not looking around and saying what actually helps me. What do Sikhs believe in? And I think and this goes along with cancel culture as well. So I think these type of conversations are important because we're all like-minded. I think we all have the same issues at heart, and I think we all want to see the Sangash flourish. We want to see our communities get better. But unfortunately, there are certain elements within along the political spectrum who do not believe in that an other side exists. They don't believe that someone can sort of deviate from sort of a particular ideology, and I certainly don't subscribe to that sort of method of going about things.
Yeah, so just going off of that last point Karam made, I don't know if you remember Shamsher, but I reached out to you a while back now regarding an issue that came up here in West Virginia in America, where the Boy Scouts of America here like kind of condemned the Sikh genocide, and my
Yeah.
dad was there, and they kind of shut my dad down, saying that uh, you can't talk about the Sikh genocide here. So, like Karam said, we do have clear issues that we're all passionate about, and that we do want the Sikh genocide to be known and to be made aware. And I think there's just different avenues that we can all go about in achieving those causes that we're passionate about.
For me, like, I think the most important thing is, and I think you'd all agree, that our politics needs to be informed by Gurmat, and especially not by conservative Christian values that are built on genocide, that are built on oppression. Whatever surface level connections we can make, they're not going to ultimately serve us. And because those values, right, it's important where we're standing, we look at the foundation of the system and we look at what it's built upon, and we can't ignore that. Because our history hasn't taught us to, to compartmentalize in the way that, modern Western states do. They kind of de-link from their origins as genocidal plantations that are built on slavery, that are built on oppression. So we can't de-link the two. For me, one of the important questions is, and this is where, a lot of the Sikh political representation drops off, is acknowledging the legitimacy of the state. So the state hasn't been there for long enough to exert control on our bodies and our minds the way it does, and it's become a completely normal thing. We accept like the state as the final authority, and for us as Sikhs, that we know that's not true, because Guru Granth Sahib is Kul Alam Di Satti Sarkar, the true sovereign, the true power of all of the creation. So for us, accepting the legitimacy of the state in order to participate in the system is an act of violence on our bodies, and we can't conflate participation with being held hostage. We didn't ask to be born here, and the fact that we are here, we need to look at the conditions of how we arrived in these countries, the context of the system within which we're engaging, and that should inform our politics, and Gur Sikhi should inform our politics. We can't de-link, what the nature of this system is, what the nature of this political beast is, and within that, any conversation that we have will be inherently reductive. It won't be explicit. We can talk about genocide, but we can't talk about our armed resistance. Any kind of Sikh voice that we've seen will always, any Sikh voice that participates within electoral politics will always be held to the values of their party and the structure of their party. I'll give you a very concrete example with Bill 21 in Canada. You've got Sikh MPs that are very prominent that refuse to engage in the legal action and the condemnation of Bill 21, even though it affects them personally as individuals, because they're beholden to vote banks and they're beholden to the culture of their parties, and racist Gore inform politics more than Punjabi people do, and they have a more powerful lobby, and it will always be the minority within that. I personally don't believe these systems will change from within. I personally don't. The trade-off for a white supremacist system to physically see me and acknowledge my existence isn't worth, the moral dilemma of participating in it. I've lived in the UK my entire life. I've never voted. I only vote in Gurdwara elections, because I feel within that system, the impact that we can have, it can be greater. And I only participate in Gurdwara elections because I believe that ultimately that system of voting within our Gurdwara is an imposition. It doesn't serve our community, and we need a better Gursikh model that we had before we entered into this 1940s, post-1947 world, where we're our religion has to be something that informs us culturally, where Sikhi can't be represented in a secular state. No politician can advocate on behalf of a religious community if that's how the state wants to define us, because it's a secular state. That's not what politicians do. They don't represent religions. They don't represent religious communities. And I think a lot of the times there's too much conflation, and we're not explicit about what this system is about. If we're talking about a specific outcome, that we want the right to wear our kirpan. Firstly, that right has been given to us by Guru Sahib. If the state takes that right away, do we take our kirpans off? What is the outcome, right? Like, how are we going to participate in these systems? Yeah.
I think the issue comes regarding the kirpan issue. We have to look at it within the community first. So, for example, here in America, we have several Sikh organizations like Sikh Coalition, SALDEF, and personally, I call the kirpan flat out a weapon of defense. And Sikh Coalition came at me saying that you can't call it a weapon; you have to call it a symbol. So, I think before we look at the government, we have to look at ourselves and come to consensus on what our Sikhi actually is and what our kirpan actually stands for. So once we are united on that front, then we can go about and change the
just to interject there, right? Like, the confusion arises because of the participation in the system. That's the act of violence. When we try to translate, there's no doubt, like, when we talk about Punjabi ki kirpan kiya, sanu guru ne shastar ditya, shastar ke adeen hai raj, we know what a kirpan is. We know inherently this is a weapon. It's not a defensive weapon. It's a weapon to protect ourselves. We don't go as far as some of these racist gore do with this is my weapon and this is how I protect my freedom. But Guru Sahib has bestowed us with shastar because we directly demand a control over power. We don't want a portion of power from the state. We want our own power. This is what our sovereignty is tied to, right? Like, without shastar, without hatiyar, how can our Raj be protected? How can our Taram be protected? But as soon as we start translating and we start engaging with these systems, then the kirpan becomes an article of faith. It becomes a religious symbol. It becomes, a defensive thing. Like, the definition changes. And like, in theory, I could agree with you, but in practice, I've never seen the outcome. All I've seen is these really, really horrible, violent compromises that just erase what Sikhi is. We've got an MP in the UK that speaks like a Gora, like he says his name like a Gora. Like, when he says like Amrit, he'll say Amrit. When he says the star, he'll say like turban. When he says his name, he'll say it like a Gora. And like, for me, that's like it. That's not what Sikh representation should look like, and you accept the authority and the sovereignty and the legitimacy of the Rani in the UK. And like, for me, these are like fundamental contradictions, and they're really difficult conversations to have. This is when you start getting labeled a radical and an extremist or a fundamentalist or whatever language, this system can conjure at you in order to define you as being the other that needs to be eliminated. So for me, in a world where we've got like the Sikh politician, and we've got Sant Janel Singh, they're constantly at conflict with each other. And whether the Sikh politician will say Sant Janel Singh is my hero, I look up to Sant Janel Singh, but they don't acknowledge what he stood for and what he represented. And this isn't like 100 years ago when we're talking about the sovereignty of the Khalsa. This is like 35 years ago. Sant Janel Singh explicitly rejects the authority of the state over the Sikh. And this is, the root cause of our issue. And we're only in these countries because of colonial exploitation, because of, our labor was being exploited, because Punjab was, we didn't see a future in Punjab. So we abandoned Punjab in the hope that we could earn money and go back one day and make it better. And that one day never came. Instead, we ended up in these countries and trying to find a place. And I think that conversation is always stripped from any discussion around Sikh politics. And for me, that's the political conversation that needs to take place. Not, will Gore give us the right to wear our kirpan? Ota right to hega hi hega ya,
But hega, but it's always, we're always at a battle because we still
that battle is important. That battle is everything. Like, oh, la ke dikhon, like, fir maja auga. Oh, ek bari keh do ke tadi dastara kirpana launiya ya, and then we can say, oh, people will suffer, they'll do this. But what have we achieved? That we can't define that as nuksan, as damage. That sangarsh, out of that struggle, that's what unity comes out of. If we're going to talk about being united, if we're going to talk about ekta of the panth, that's always come out of that struggle. It's always come out of the sangarsh. When we live in this false sense of comfort, it just creates more and more mess and layers and breaks our identity down to the point where we're struggling to define ourselves or who we are within this this world that we find ourselves in now.
Yeah. So I definitely agree with some of what Shamsher is saying. I think I think when you read about like sort of violence of translation, there is some, I think, in that harm that occurs through translation. So I think that's definitely an issue here, and I think that's an issue. I think it is a structural issue. I think to make things more palatable, we do end up making compromises and sort of reducing the way we see Sikhi. So I think that is a core issue, and I think it came from a sense of fear that maybe belonged to some of these folks who are now 30, 40 years old. Personally, the people who I know who are sort of unapologetically Sikh, who are involved, I have no doubt that this is something that they do not fear. Like pronouncing their name, or I think just being authentically Sikh, I think it's within that sphere. So I think when it comes to the institutions, I think two things. I think first, I do fundamentally believe that the country is very different than it was 300 years ago. And I think we can have differences on sort of interpretation of what the system means and sort of how oppression continues. But in terms of conservative ideas, I believe in a bipartisan coalition. I think there are deeply faithful politicians who represent faith communities, Christian communities, other Jewish communities, and I think these are regional partners. I think we are a deeply faithful community, and I think in some regard there is a resonance there with other faith communities who have similar issues about bureaucrats coming into their religious centers of worship. So I think those are issues that the other faith communities have, and I think we can find resonance. I think some might call it superficial, but I think I just have I guess we just disagree on that. I think second thing, I think the country, it's about subverting institutions. I think when Shamsher Singh came to UC Berkeley, I think he said it very eloquently that the university Berkeley has a history of being oppressive. I think certain spots in the university were literally where Native Americans were killed or slavery used to occur. So I think there is a deeply traumatic history. And then I think, how do we justify going to that university? And I think Shamsher Singh put it well, is that we are subverting these institutions to use for our benefit. And I think to some extent, I think this happens all the time, and a lot of different communities do this, in which we get inside these institutions. I think no institution is relatively perfect. I think a lot of them across the world have fundamental histories that are definitely genocidal and oppressive. But I think when we enter these communities, how to use them to benefit us, and I think that's important. So I think there is real, to wear a kirpan or to have an AR-15. I think that's my right as a Sikh. Would I subvert the government to do so? I have, a lot of conservatives and libertarians would agree with you that it is within your bounds to subvert it, to sort of rebel against the government to make sure they have make sure you have the right to bear arms. So I think I think fundamentally when it comes to the ground reality, we all agree that the only person that's telling me to stay armed is my guru and no one else, right? So I think that sort of linkage is there, and I think we have to continue to tell our young folks that that's where we get this right from. I think this, even the Second Amendment thing, it is superficial. I think there is a resonance there, but it isn't as deep as what Sikhi is, right? It isn't as deep as sort of the itias of being armed and having shastra. It's nowhere near that deep. But at the same time, I think it is a point of sort of connection that we have with certain folks who believe in the same ideas, who live within our communities at the end of the day, right? And I'm someone who I don't sort of believe in judging people by their group identities. I definitely judge people as individuals and not as sort of some product of historical oppression. So I think there is connections to be made, and I agree with Karanveer that like there are institutions that we belong in to help our communities, and then I think at the same time when you have to test the institutions, you're gonna exit them, and I think that's what I believe. I think when the institution becomes oppressive to the point where you believe you're a Sikhi or your brotherhood, your brotherhood in the Khalsa is compromised, and you have to exit those situations. I think, for example, obviously the Tarmi Fojis who were involved in the Indian Army, for them, I think the way the Kharkus or even Punjabis looked at them wasn't they don't look at them as sellouts. I think they looked at them as deeply disciplined people. But they believe that when the breaking point came, is that you have to exit those institutions or they become too oppressive, or you become complicit in those oppression, and they did that. So I think you can, be a Sikh and participate in a way that you keep your Sikhi and Khalsa. You can keep that all intact, but it has to be only to the point where you feel like you're not compromised, right? And I think when you are, you have to exit those institutions, right? So if you're a cop and you're told to do something that is completely against what you believe as a Sikh, or if you're in the army and you're told to do something that's completely against, or a mission or anything of this sort, I think you have to exit those institutions right away. And I think we have a history of doing that when it comes to 1984. And I don't think Sikhs, and I think people who lived in Punjab looked at army men in the same way that I think we do, or didn't look at even Punjab police in the same way. I think they looked at them as like I think flawed institutions, but I think they definitely didn't hold this prejudice against individual officers if they had nothing to do, if they didn't do any harm, right? So I think it's very nuanced here. I don't think it's black and white. I don't think we can pit ourselves into one corner or the other. I think we have to look at situations by case basis.
If I may sort of interject with a question here, it seems like the kind of core of the discussion would be like incrementalism versus accelerationism, right? So a question to Shamsher, and then a sort of reverse question to Karanveer and Karam Singh. Shamsher, do you think that electoral politics could be a good way to gather like sort of a revolutionary sentiment within the community? Kind of like, I think it's undeniable that figures like Bernie and Trump vastly radicalized people on either side, right? So do you think that we could use electoral politics to garner something similar within the Sikh community? And then Karam and Karanveer, do you guys think that reform is effective in systems that are unfit to serve the Sikh community? And do you guys even think that the systems that exist in, I guess, America today would be unfit to serve the Sikh community?
Yeah, I mean, just before I come on to that question, you know what Karam was saying about, you know, the police and the military and stuff like that, you know, Punjab and Tadmi Faujis. We got to look at the context of how, you know, the Punjab police arrived and how, you know, the Indian military was created. And that's really, really important, because they didn't just emerge and they weren't like neutral. I mean, we individuals on one side, but what the system is designed to create and how it took away our fighting capacity and redirected our energy. You know, these militaries were created as mercenary forces. People joined, you know, the British Indian Army for rewards of money and land. And at the time, you know, from folk songs, you know, there's a guy called Amarjit Chandan who's done some research into this. And you look at the folk songs in Punjab, they called these people mercenaries. You know, they begged them not to join the war of the Farangis. And now that kind of, you know, participation in the system of colonial exploitation and oppression has become Sikh history. And the history of the Gaddars, the history of Kartar Singh Sarabha, the history of the Babbar Akalis, you know, the radical, extremist, violent histories, they're not the mainstreamed Sikh history. They've become like footnotes. But if it wasn't for their resistance against colonial systems of oppression and exploitation, individuals participating in that aside, if they didn't take a collective stand against those systems, we wouldn't have coordinates to say, you know, this is what Sikh resistance looked like during that period, because we'd all have joined the British military and we wouldn't have this problem. But because we had people outside sounding the Nishan, sounding the call of the Khalsa that we're sovereign, that participating in these systems, you can personally benefit. Your family might benefit, you'll get land, you'll get money, but our sovereignty, we're losing something much deeper. And Punjab police, as we know, is probably the worst example, because Punjab police went on, you know, to torture and rape and kill an entire generation. The same with the Indian Army. And the reason we had those Karmi Fauji is because they gave an oath to Guru Granth Sahib before they gave an oath to serving the Indian state. You can't do that in America. You don't do that here in Britain. In here, you join the military, you serve an oath to serve the nation. So that's that consciousness, that psyche is, being eroded. We're conflating the two all the time now. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge the context. I think inherently participating in these systems, just to come onto your question, it radicalizes us, because when you live consciously and you're aware to these realities of what these systems are, what participation actually is, that by participating in these systems, we're becoming compromised, our values are becoming compromised. That inherently will radicalize you, because it might take an incident of racism, it might take an incident of poverty, it might take something else. But you can find the limits of electoral politics fairly quickly as a brown Sikh, particularly as a turbaned, bearded male. You can be in America for I don't know how long you guys have been there. Most Americans will think you're a Muslim, or they'll think you're Osama bin Laden, because that's the most popularized image of a turban, bearded man. We know the very real implications of that on the bodies of Sikh men in America. So yeah, I think these systems are inherently limited. They're violent. They're oppressive. We don't arrive in them. Like in the UK, there's like 600,000, 700,000 Sikhs. And all of those families, the vast majority of them are tied to the British Empire. Their grandparents served the British Empire. That's why the vast majority of Sikhs are here in the UK. If you're a Gora and you fought for the Nazis, you can, and your grandfather fought for the Nazis, you can get on a train and come to Britain and practically live here and work here. But if you're a Punjabi whose grandfather fought for Britain and you want to come from Punjab and live here, it's difficult. So the only people that live in these countries that have managed to penetrate their borders are those whose parents, gave their head to these systems, and we're still arriving. And I think it's very easy for us to talk about participation within these systems and representation, but the vast majority of poor Sikhs that are, like Gurpreet Kaur, who dies in the desert, on her way into America, the vast majority of us are still not seen as human beings within these systems. We don't have these privileges. We're still arriving. We haven't arrived here. Even us living here, being born here in Britain, these stupid Gore don't even know who we are. And like we've been here for how many generations now? And we talk about the only way we can explain ourselves to them is saying, oh, we fought in the World War. Our values are your values. We're just like you. We're not Muslims. We might look different, but essentially we believe the same things that you believe in. We have to define ourselves according to their understanding of what we think their understanding is of us. And that's a massively violent process. And I hope it radicalizes more young Sikhs, and they reach the limits of their existence, in the so-called West.
Karam, you want to go first, or?
So what was the question again that you posed to us?
Okay, the question that I posed to you guys was, do you think that reform is possible or effective in systems that are fundamentally unfit to serve Sikhs? And do you even think, to begin with, that these systems are fundamentally unfit to serve Sikhs?
Yeah, so I think I think it's hard to generalize about all systems, and it's difficult because I think there's certain institutions that have a larger legacy of oppression, and there's institutions that are relatively sort of they don't have that history, right? So say, for example, it could be a sort of a regional assemblyman who cares about some of these communities who have certain issues within their sort of personal purview that they want to be solved, and he's appointed to some sort of commission, right? So those are fairly sort of non-problematic places in which Sikhs can exist, and they can exist fully being a Sikh, right? And even to Shamsher Singh's points about we're swearing an oath, I think for me, like even like when you Karanveer, you probably swore on an oath, like they do the little swear on the oath little Bible, or you could do it even on a gutka, like I've seen some folks do. So I think there is sort of a genealogy of Americans supporting people being deeply loyal to their faith. That has happened. I think Christian conservatives are a perfect example of that. I think they're very. I think they put their faith before their country at certain times, right? So I think the same thing for Sikhs. I think young Sikhs should definitely put their faith above anything else, because I think this is what gives us our value system to the world, and this is where we find our sort of identities from. So I think they should be prioritized. So I really can't answer that question in a way that it, without being sort of morally, have sort of moral absolutist sort of version of it, right? That's sort of the only way I could answer that question, is if I say these systems are oppressive and I'm just going to completely isolate myself. I personally think that will do more damage to the community. So I would go about it in the same way, like I said before. If you're a Sikh, I think you should stay true to your roots. I think be unapologetic and give authentic stories. And I think there are problems with the way that we've told stories. And I think there's that fear within our parents' community that you're not supposed to speak a certain way. When you explain yourselves through a sort of common connection. We fought in World War I, we fought in World War II, or explain history in a way that points towards sort of a connection with America or Canada or Britain or wherever Sikhs are. So I think we have to be authentic in our stories too, right? And I think there are some beautiful, authentic stories that make us a part of America that aren't necessarily us just fighting wars, right? There are other parts of our history where we are with, we're with working class Chinese immigrants in the railroads in the Sierra Nevadas. There are moments in which there are spectacular displays of us contributing in a way that isn't negative. But so I think we should highlight those, and I think there is fair criticisms to what we have done so far in electoral politics. And I think that's why a lot of this rhetoric is emerging, is because I don't think we've given our authentic selves to the public. And I think we've given this very tamed version in which we sort of are saying, we were basically always like mini Americans in in Punjab, right? So I think that's sort of the narrative. I think what the new narrative that needs to be created is that Sikhs are definitely a unique people, and I think we have very authentic stories, and we're living here as a community, and that isn't necessarily going to change, and we have to come to work together to do so. In terms of radicalization, I think there's two different types of radicalization. I think there's obviously, radicalization when it comes to caring about Sikh issues. I think that's important. I don't think that's radicalization. I think that's an obligation of every Sikh to make sure that your presence in this country, especially America, we don't have any connection with the American Army or the British Empire, but we came as a result of the trauma in the 80s, right? And that's where most of the migration happened. Obviously, there was families that came here earlier, but the bulk of the migration happened in the 80s. And I think that what that should tell the youth is you're here for a reason. And I think that reason is to live your life in a way in which you honor the reason you're here. And I think that's the reason you're here is obviously to live out your life in Sikhi Jeevan, but also be a voice for the people that didn't necessarily have the chance to come over, or be the voice for the folks that experienced so much trauma in the 80s, right? So I think that sort of radicalization, or if you guys want to call it that can happen. In terms of partisan radicalization, I think that's hurtful to the Sikh cause. I think we're sort of the only community that is so vehemently opposed to sort of different types of stratification when it comes to our political spectrum. I think other communities are definitely, I think the Jewish community, for example, right? No one puts their horse in one party. I don't think we have a horse in this election. I think we can have a horse in regional politics, but at the end of the day, partisan politics are very superficial on a level. I think to get caught over that is disruptive, and it's going to hurt the Sikh cause. I think we have to build a coalition with people we don't necessarily agree with. That happens all the time. I think in Sikh history, there were moments in which, we did negotiate with people who we considered the enemy. We did seek arms or other sort of have sort of political engagements with individuals or entities or even states that had done so much harm to other people, right? So these nuances exist and that they've always had. So I think for Sikhs to go into the world and say we're going to be completely morally absolute and we're not going to compromise with anything, I think it sets us back a long time. I think it's like Shamsher Singh, we talk about him being at war with the state. Shamsher Singh was at war with the Indian state, right? And I think the subsequent leadership after the attack in 1984 made it very clear that what they wanted the diaspora to do, right? They wanted the diaspora to engage in a way which helped the Sikhs in Punjab post 84, right? So this is why Gurmeet Singh Olak was appointed by the 1986 Sarbat Khalsa, right? So there was a very clear mission of what type of advocacy needs to happen, right? So I think to completely sort of isolate yourself from these electoral politics, I think what it actually does, and I think I think it's ahistorical for us to do this, to say that people that would participate, and particularly people who would participate to help the people in Punjab, they are somehow, it's sort of a departure from actual how actual Sikhs could operate. A lot of Sikhs in the 80s, especially our parents' generation, came to America, came to Canada, and they did advocacy in a way that they saw fit. And for us to say, I think, oh no, those guys were compromising their Sikhi is I think a relatively new way of thinking, right? I think no one who participated in the 80s and 90s, I think, the Sikhs, our elders who participated, who tried to get things done. I think the Canadian sort of project, I think that's been a little bit more nuanced. I think here in America, where we see Gurmeet Singh Khalsa, the Council of Khalistan, other sort of institutions that were created to lobby, have done a lot of good work and almost got to certain points, right? And then there was other issues that came about and infighting and etc. And that's the reason they sort of didn't come to fruition. But I think we have to move the torch forward. I think we have to. It's a very nasty world out there. It's every community, I think, has a history. I think it's sort of a Hobbesian view of people being at war with each other, right? And I think that's generally correct. So I think we have to go into the world with that sense, is that we have to uplift our communities around us and we have to uplift ourselves, right? And I think it's upon us to do so, because we are seeing, I can't speak to Bryn, but we are seeing a problem. I think there is a crisis that Sikhs are facing. There's a crisis of identity that Sikhs are facing. And the crisis is, I think, explains a lot of the reasons why people are for latching on to particular ideologies and without latching onto a larger sort of Sikh narrative that, our loyalty lies to the Singhs and Bars of our communities and not to some ideology created that has a sort of a particular European origin, right? Because at the end of the day, a lot of these ideologies are very, very European in origin. So I think, I don't want to ramble on, but what I'm trying to say is that in terms of radicalization, I think that as long as you're dedicated to the Sikh community's issues, I personally would call, I wouldn't care necessarily sort of other political views that you have. I think as long as you're dedicated to the Sikh community in terms of their issues, I think you can be a part of the Khalsa. And I think that sort of radicalization should be occurring when it comes to Sikh issues. But I think radicalization in sort of partisan politics, I don't think that's it's a bad way to go about things, and I don't think we have a horse in this election. I think that the only horse I think I would have is definitely saying, hey, Trump's presidency has hurt people, right? And that's the horse I would have. Like, I'm going to go out and vote, and the reason I'm going to go out and vote is because I feel like Trump has hurt people, right? And I think that to stand back and to do nothing about that is something that I can't do personally. So for me, I'm not too vested in partisan politics. I think parties can offer solutions to help material conditions of your communities, and if those solutions fit you, then vote for them, right? And if those solutions will help your communities, right? It's very important for you to do so, right? So I'll let Karanveer go on since I kind of been rambling.
Yeah. So all good points, Karam. So I'll just give like a little story growing up. So going to school, I'm sure in America we've all experienced this, where we're sitting in history class and social studies class and opening the textbook, and there's literally no image except for white people. It's all, when we think of politics in America, we have this idea that it's run by old white men, and that's kind of the reason that's motivated me to get involved in the political process, is because it's not, if we just sit back and say the system's not going to change, nothing's going to happen, then obviously nothing's going to happen, because we have to get involved, and that's how we're going to make that change to kind of start the process of changing the system and the flaws that we've seen growing up and heard about in our lives. So, and I think that the presidential election does matter, as well as every other election, going from the state, local, county levels. They all matter. And as Karam said, the current president has caused severe issues, and hate crimes have escalated, and not just against Sikhs, but minorities in general. So, and we shouldn't dissuade youth from finding ways to be engaged and being confident in their Sikhi. So if a Sikh Najwan wants to go out in the community and get involved in turn for a politician, then he should be encouraged, or she should be encouraged, because that's not only making them confident in who they are, but it's also raising awareness of their sarup and their identity in that sphere that they're getting out into. So I think it's definitely a tough question to answer, Juptej, but there are steps that we can take to kind of work towards solving these issues that we see in this country and in other places. We have to get involved, we have to get engaged, and if that isn't the way you see fit, then find other avenues, like Shamsher in the UK is working with the National Sikh Youth Federation, and they're doing good work. For example, the grooming issues. I was watching that video that Shamsher linked on his tweet, and all valid points that you raised. So we all have our own ways, and personally, I think that if we want to be confident in our Sarup, and if we want to raise awareness of Sikhi, at least in America, then you have to get involved in some way. And for me, that's been politics.
No. You know, like the alternative to not voting isn't not doing anything. And this is constantly like being presented, that voting alone is doing something and not voting is doing nothing. And I think, that's nothing could be further from the truth. Voting is something that you're engaging in, like, every couple of years. But taking the other stand that this system, the way it is, acknowledging it for what it is, isn't going to solve any issues, puts more responsibility and demands more from you than voting does. And it demands more personal accountability, because if we take America, America is now what it always has been, and it will, largely will probably continue being the way it is. And it's heading in a really scary direction, if its past is any indicator. So, this idea that the next president, the next election, you hear that every single time. And this is one of the inherent flaws of this system, that the next guy, this is the chance, this is the election where everything matters. If we don't get this person out, it's over. But America's always been this. And not participating in that system, I think, isn't about being black and white. It's about making a really informed decision, and demanding more from yourselves and your communities, and taking direct action, directly being involved in organizing locally, educating youngsters, and building institutions that are independent of the structure of the state. And it's a proven model. If it wasn't, we literally would not exist as a people. Is because we took that claim of power, because Guru Sahib gave us Patshahi, our sovereignty, and gave us a method to exist in this world, demanded more from us than incremental change, demanded that we end oppression and oppressive system. Khalsa Soe Malesh Se Jare. We want to end this cycle of oppression and violence. We want to interrupt it. We want to throw our bodies onto the machinery of oppression. We're not our goal isn't to be attached to living our lives and to increasing our material existence and trying to seek comfort. That's not our goal. And I think the further we get from that, the more kind of, distorted our being becomes in these countries, and we buy into that rhetoric, that participation means accountability and change, and it doesn't. And I haven't seen it. And I think, we can agree, like, or amongst us, like what our nishana should be. If we're explicitly saying, what, we need to enter, like as Karam was saying, if we want to enter into electoral politics because we want to support our resistance movement, we want to support Khalistan because, we need our own desh in this world. Without our own country, we're going to be begging from sarkars, other governments to, help us. And what does that help look like, right? Like, we go beyond acknowledging that there's a genocide. Will America help us militarily militarily to take back control of Punjab. We got Harjit Sajjan's the defense minister of Canada. Some people are talking about how he's going to send the Canadian army to help us in Punjab. What does that look like, right? If we have a Sikh president in the White House, does that mean liberation of Khalistan? Does that mean America is now an ally? We're putting so much faith in this one individual, and that again isn't our way, because what tends to happen, like Karam's, here, and Karanveer's here. Say tomorrow Karanveer becomes, an MP or whatever, he's gonna distance the flipping hell away from people like me. He's gonna be like, what's a Shamsher? I don't even know that guy. Like, I'm not associated with these radical extremists, and that's what's going to be demanded of him to exist within that system and to have legitimacy, because he's going to have to define himself by how white he is and how interpretable to whiteness he is, right? So he's not going to want to participate or acknowledge an extremist person that wants to make a country in as Ujjwal Dosanjh said, in a backward place, in a backward time, right? So this is what happens, that when the legitimacy comes from the state, it becomes very difficult. You start holding on to that legitimacy. Having the office becomes the goal. Staying in power becomes the goal. The other stuff of Khalistan, of our Azadi, of justice, those things become like just talking points and rhetorics and performances that are enacted again and again, and they continually re-traumatizing our community because we continually putting faith and hope into that system. Right now, the accountability comes from the Sangat. If we have a Sikh president in America, we have a Sikh prime minister, that prime minister isn't accountable to Guru, they're accountable to the British state. Their values aren't going to be accountable to Guru Granth Sahib. They're not going to be able to recognize the authority of Guru Granth Sahib over the authority of the state. And these are dangerous ideas. We've been persecuted and killed for these ideas throughout our itihas, that we don't want to accept any domination over our bodies, over the land, or over over Qudrat, over the dunya. There's no domination should exist in the world. A world, an alternative is possible. It means more work, it means more accountability, it means acknowledging everybody's humanity. And these systems don't. You have to participate in state violence. You have to participate in a system that's built on violence, and that doesn't acknowledge our humanity. So if Kallu, one of you guys, becomes a prime minister, it still doesn't mean that I'm a human being now. I'll still be a religious fundamentalist extremist. You'll be the human being because you've entered into that arena. The rest of us will still be violent, and we see it continuously. Every Sikh that's within this political arena, let's just talk about the diaspora. Like, ignore the mess that is Sikh politics in within the Indian state. Every Sikh within the diaspora that's in politics only talks about us as victims of genocide, and it only talks about justice. That's something that comes from the Indian state acknowledging what it did, or a settler colony passing a resolution to acknowledge that what happened to us was genocide. We flipping know it was genocide. Acknowledgement doesn't solve it. Acknowledgement is a small step onto, okay, now it's been acknowledged. Now the outcome is, why did this happen? Why did this genocide take place? And we see this all the time with all of our conversation around genocide and violence and us being the victims. The question's never answered why this happened. Why did India decide to kill tens of thousands of young Sikhs? Like, what was it? Oh, it was because of, political conflict. What was the political conflict? We wanted our sovereignty. We wanted our independence. Khalistan continually gets erased from that conversation. And for me, that's one of the main things, right? If I want civil rights in the UK, I don't need a Sikh MP for that. If I need to explain something, I can do it to a Gora, a Kala. It doesn't really make a difference. I don't need a Sikh in office, to be an ally. We can build alliances with people. We don't need a Sikh for that. What we need Sikhs for is this idea that a Sikh in office will be sympathetic to our struggle and to our cause, and will raise that voice. And consistently, every single time they fail. And they don't, and that system will never allow them to do it. So not participating in electoral politics isn't turning your back on your responsibility. It's demanding more from yourself and from everyone around you. It's investing more into your community, because the Gurdwara is still the hub. The Gurdwara is the hub of Sikh education and Sikh life. If you want to learn how to be a Sikh, you need Guru Granth Sahib. If you want to learn how to exist as a Sikh, you need the Guru's Darbar. You need an Ashan Sahib. You need Amrit. You need all of these things. And none of that is going to come from the state. None of that's going to come from having a Sikh president or a prime minister. Tomorrow, the British government could pass a resolution and say, we're going to close all the Gurdwara. Does that mean Sikhs no longer exist? Does that mean that we need the law to recognize us and then we'll exist? That will cause a massive conflict and a sangharsh. And through that sangharsh, we'll find ourselves and we'll orient ourselves to what matters, which is our existence as sovereign beings. Rather than engaging in the politics of Subedari, where we're, given a piece of the table, where we're given a seat at the table. We want to smash that table and burn it to pieces, because it exists on the bodies of, enslaved and genocided people. That where do we stand, right? What do we have to acknowledge? What do we have to allow to happen to have a seat at that table? And we've had a seat at that table. We've had a seat at that table for a long time, and nothing's come out of it. The people, as soon as you take a seat on that table, you turn your back on everyone else, and we've seen it continuously. And for me, the Punjab's politics is crucial to this, because we've had Sikhs in all facets of Punjab's politics within the Indian state, within the politics of the Indian state as well. We continue to have Sikhs. Like every single chief minister of Punjab has been a turban-wearing Sikh man. Through the period of genocide, through the period of India, violently suppressing us, it's been Sikhs that have been, KPS Gill was a Sikh. He was a dastar-wearing, dari-having, a butcher of Punjab. So where does that factor into our conversation?
So are we going back and forth still, or?
Well, I can make
real quick. We are
quick
coming
points.
up on about an hour now, so we can respond to the final couple of points, and then sort of wrap it up and go into closing statements.
Sure.
I'm good to go, then I'll go.
I
just
think,
noticed as well, Karanveer's got the Khalistan on the back of your wall.
Yep.
Where?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I have Gurmeet Singh Olak's book actually, so is the record. Just an example of the record, right? So there's an article on this. I think it's Dan Burton or another congressman from Indiana. He goes to Delhi, and to Delhi, there's an article on this. He talks to the delegation there. It's like, I want to talk about Khalistan, right? And this is all on record, right? And Gurmeet Singh Olak infamously said that, we're going to make sure Dan Burton gets his own statue in Khalistan, right? Because I think that's the type of advocacy. I think that's why Gurmeet Singh Olak was such a monumental figure. I think there isn't enough praise about him, about the work he does. So I think
he did hold a political office, though, right? He did that all outside of the system, right?
Yeah, but I think if Gurmeet Singh Olak had a friend in Congress, right, that was a brother to him, I think that would have went further. But I think when Shamsher Singh talks about groundwork, I think that's incredibly important. And this point goes into that too, is that it doesn't necessarily have to happen to electoral politics. I think most of the building we're going to do as Sikhs in terms of building up our community, I think building up the values of Sikhi and Sikh Siddhant and sort of that sort of Panthic rigor in people is going to happen through organizations that don't exist at electoral politics. I think, but I think there are sort of mechanisms to make that happen, right? So there can be, for example, there can be certain parties that offer sort of a hands-off when it comes to education, that believe that you shouldn't be maybe the public schools shouldn't be teaching what your children need to know. Instead, you get to teach them, right? So maybe homeschooling is encouraged, or something like school choice, where maybe there's a lot of flexibility with when it comes to building charter schools, right? Something that's happened here in Sacramento, right? So I think these are issues that the community should be taking advantage of, and I think we should inculcate a culture of being loyal to Sikh Siddhant, and I think a culture of knowing Sikh history and knowing where you belong to. And I think that does happen only through groundwork, and it doesn't happen through statements given by politicians or any of that. So, because I think at the end of the day, it's the gurdwaras, it's the other institutions that help end up building community power. I'm not saying that that community power, it can exist alone, but I think it can be more effective if we also are participating in electoral politics. And I think when it comes to accountability, that's incredibly important. But these politicians make statements when it comes to human rights. Even human rights it doesn't tell the full picture it doesn't show the full story. And I definitely agree that we have individuals who twist the translations to make it more palatable for certain communities, right? And I think that is a problem. I think they have to tell the full story in terms of where we want to go. I don't think acknowledgement is a political position. I agree with you 100%. I think a political position is something that other communities do, right? When the Kurdish community shows up, they're not talking about can the Iraqi government can they acknowledge what they did to us? No, they're talking about, hey, what can we do on the ground to materially support our communities? When we're talking about when when other groups come, they're talking about sanctions, right? So I think this all occurs, and it's a very it's a very real and sort of material changes that can occur, but it all happens beyond sort of just acknowledgement, right? So I think that's 100% right. I think we have to move forward past acknowledgement. I think we have to talk about sanctions. We have to talk about sort of geopolitical isolation. We have to talk about other issues. I think these are incredibly hard issues to convince people of. That's true. I think it's a step-by-step process, but at the end of the day, I think we can get there if we build community support. And I think it has happened before, in which the community has come together, and I think we have effectively lobbied to almost get there, right? So I think I do believe that it gets that Sikh politics gets a bad rap because of the history of it, and I think it is bad because we've seen that Sikh MPs, MLAs, or congressmen, they get to the top and they really turn their backs, because I think they're definitely focused on their career and they're focused on their issues. I think it's up to the Sikh community to hold these people accountable, right? And we have to talk about action. I think we can't talk about just acknowledgement. I think we have to say that if America is a leader of human rights in the world, and if they want global leadership, then I think we need leadership in these issues, right? And I think what's happening is incredibly problematic. I think the Trump sort of Modi nexus, this is incredibly dangerous. I think Democrats used to be very fond of the Indian state in the late 80s and 90s, and now I think sort of the fact that the Republicans have also are very are supporting the Trump narrative, which definitely believes in sort of nationalism across the world, and I think that's very, very problematic. I think it's generally a departure from, I think, this somewhat Republican thought that they didn't weren't focused on India, and they definitely weren't focused on Indian nationalism. But I think now they incredibly are, because they see allies in Modi and in Indian nationalists. I think this is a very dangerous nexus, and I think if Republican Sikhs or conservative Sikhs, they have to work towards destroying that nexus and making sure that if American leadership is going to be there, whether we have a say in or not, that American leadership might as well be positive in helping the material conditions and being the voice for marginalized communities in India.
So Gurmeet Singh Aulik was actually a close friend of my dad's. My dad worked with Gurmeet Singh Aulik several times, and Gurmeet Singh Aulik actually lobbied congressmen. So lobbying is an act of engaging in politics. So those congressmen would have never known about the genocide hadn't Gurmeet Singh Aulik gotten them aware of it. And voting does matter. It might be different in the UK, but here in America, we have the current president because over 1 million people didn't vote in the 2016 presidential election. So voting does have not voting does have consequences, and voting actually can make a difference. And when we say that we're trying to victimize ourselves, we're trying to raise awareness of the Sikh genocide in these political spheres, we as Sikhs might know what happened in 1984. We as Sikhs might know what went on with the Indian government and the Sikh community, but the rest of the world does not. Even to this day, there's non-Sikhs saying that 1984 was a riot and it wasn't a genocide. So the fact that these Sikh politicians like Jagmeet Singh are raising awareness of the Sikh genocide, his visa got not denied because he raised his voice on the issue. That's raising awareness. And I was in Kansas a few years back, and a random person on the street, I was doing some awareness work, and that person knew about the Sikh genocide. And I asked how, and they said because they read on the internet about Jagmeet Singh's activism. So there are certain things that can be done that do benefit the community. And I definitely agree with both Shamsher, Virji, and Karam that there are constraints in political office that Sikhs do have, because it's not just when you're at that position, it's not just about your community, but it's also about other people. So in America, it's about making sure all Americans have opportunities to be successful. So oftentimes those politicians get too focused on pleasing both sides that they just totally forget about their own community. So that's not the way to go. I think that your community always comes first, and then we look and make sure that all have the opportunity to rise and be successful. And a perfect example was Deputy Sandeep Dhaliwal, who was a police officer in Texas. He was shot and killed in the line of duty, and what he did as a police officer is what raised awareness of the Sikh community in America. Because when he was shot and killed, so many across the country gathered, not because he was a police officer, but because of what he did in that uniform. He helped. He went to Puerto Rico. He did some community work, raised awareness, and through his actions, he may have made a tiny dent in that system that we see so many flaws in today. So there are plenty of ways we can go about choosing to fight for Sikh causes, and I think all are valid. And I think we have to support those movements. And I think that's how we're going to go about coming together as a community, because there's clearly diversity of thought. We can see on Twitter these days. Everyone has their own opinions. Everyone has their own stances, and just splintering off and isolating ourselves because we don't agree with so and so, it's not gonna do anything. So we have to come together, and I have hope in the future.
You know, like Sandeep Dhaliwal's story is it captures a lot, right? America sees a Sikh, that dies in uniform and honors this Sikh. They honor him as an American. Sikhs see him all over the world, and there's like, yes, this is a Sikh. This is somebody that's a proud example of a Sikh, and we all know his story. We all know his image, right? But Gurpreet Kaur, the little child that dies on the way to coming to America, what is she? Where does she belong? Is she an American? Is she a Punjabi? Why don't we acknowledge her story? Why doesn't America see her? America will see you when you die for America, when you put on a uniform. But when you're on the way to becoming an American, then you're nothing, essentially. And like, for me, that there's a conflict between the two, and we refuse to acknowledge the conflict between the two. The American police force is an oppressive entity. ICE is an oppressive entity, and our participation within these systems isn't going to change them. We could, have a bit of harm reduction of having a couple of Sikh police officers that, their values are informed by Gursikhi, so they're not going to be violent, but they're participating in an inherently racist, violent structure. So these tensions, I think, need to be at the forefront, and they need to be part of the conversation. They need to be part of the discussion. On like being part of these places where we're at, I think there's so much that isn't part of the conversation, that isn't part of the discussion, right? Like with the genocide recognition, with that conversation, we're always going to be the victims. We need to take we need that conversation, the parameters around that, to be much broader, because it doesn't account for Sikh resistance. We weren't just dying, we were also fighting back, right? The genocide was happening for a reason. I think that conversation, it captures a lot. like just on closing, because I think we're reaching it, the time and stuff. I just want to say a couple of points, right? In the UK, I'm always told, by people in the community, by elders, that you should enter into politics. You do really well. You're articulate, you're passionate. You'd thrive if you entered into politics. I don't doubt that. If my values are, were like that, I don't doubt that. But for me, like, I believe really, really strongly that the position that I hold as a Bantak Naujawan matters more. Like, anybody can enter into politics. We don't need we don't need a Sikh there in that position, as Dan Burton and Gurmeet Olak have shown and proven, right? But the Panthak position, this place, that's where we need young, strong voices. We need our articulate voices. We need that courage, because not everybody's willing to do that work. That work is much harder. You're not going to get the praise. You're not going to be in the public limelight. But that's where we need our talented minds. We don't need them in, electoral politics. Honestly, anybody can do that. And like the things that we want, the demands that we have, we need to be clear about those demands, and we need to hold those people accountable. Now, that is what success is, right? Entering into public office, becoming rich. That's what success is. The notion of existing in this world is completely defined by, a capitalist country and capitalism, and and participation within these systems of oppression. And when they see us, right, we say, "Bimi Sadida Mahan Sikh Sant Jarnail Singh, the greatest Sikh of the 20th century." This is an individual that fought for our sovereignty, that gave Shahidi and Darbar Sahib, that awakened the sleeping Sikh Qawm. Tomorrow is Sant Jarnail Singh's picture going to get taken down, and we're going to put up pictures of Sikhs that joined political parties, because they're becoming our icons now. They're becoming our aspirations. Shahidi is seen as something that's doesn't fit in with this existence. That our way of existing as a Sikh doesn't really fit into this existence. This is why we set up National Sikh Youth Federation, because in our Gurdwara, we've got pictures of Sant Jarnail Singh. In our houses, we've got pictures of our Shaheed. We know how passionate everyone is about Khalistan, but as soon as we enter into the public arena, all of those conversations just evaporate. All of a sudden, left, right, and center, the media is calling our Shaheeds terrorists. And in the recent issue with Terry Malowski, in that conversation, Khalistan has been stripped of meaning, and it's been reduced to being the right to advocate for self-determination. What if we don't want to advocate for it? What if we want to fight for it? What if we want to pick up Hatiyar for it? Then what are we within that conversation, right? Nobody's talking about Shaheed Bhai Talwinder Singh within that conversation. Terry Malowski's written this report. He's, said bad things about our Shaheeds, continuously maligning them. Nobody wants to take up that card. Nobody wants to say, these are our Shaheeds, few of us do, we'll say, these are our Shaheeds, and, this is what their Shaheedi means. But, like we've seen with Jagmeet as well and other politicians, they won't take those stances. They won't take those difficult stances. When push comes to shove, they'll always toe the line that exists. And for us, it's on us to change that line. And it's on us to change the parameters of the game, because they're not going to change from within the system. They're going to change with the grassroots advocacy and the activism that you guys are going to do outside of that. And that's where, when you're talking about the accountability is not going to come from within the system. The accountability is not going to come from the Liberal Party or the Labour Party, because they don't even understand the issues, and they're not accountable to us. We don't have any power within that. The accountability is going to come from the grassroots. And like my binti to all the young Naujawan that are talented, that have these desires, that are thinking politically, that we need to think politically outside of the limitations of the politics of settler colonial states. And we need to think about what politics and political engagement means to us when it comes to our sovereignty, when it comes to our Sangharsh, when it comes to our Shaheeds. And how are we going to take this forward, right? We've had a generation give Qurbani. We've had thousands of young Sikhs die. We can't just reduce them to victims, because they weren't all victims. And those that were made victims, there's a context to them being made targets of the Indian state violence. And for me, that's what I'm accountable to, the legacy of our Shaheeds, to our Sangharsh. And I hope that this seva continues and we get our own desh, and then ਅਸੀਂ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਨੂੰ ਦਿਖਾ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਸਿੱਖਾਂ ਦਾ ਮਤਲਬ ਕੀ ਆ, because without that we can't have America defining what it means to be a Sikh, or Britain defining what it means to be a Sikh, because they'll always define us in the image of that best suits them, like Saragrahi, right? Like, that's the image that Britain loves of Sikhs, the martial race, the loyal soldier. And that's not who we are. That's not our history. That's the history of servitude and exploitation. That's not the history of the Nyara Khalsa Panth.
Does anybody else have any final statements they would like to make?
Yeah, I could just say a few things. I think my message to youth, and I think Shamsher's on point. It's all about grassroots. I think it's all about authentic Sikh being. I think it's being a part of the Gurdwaras, being a part of the youth. I think cultivating this Panthic rigor in people. I think that's incredibly important. I think it's to seek out allies that that align with you, who believe in the same values as you. I think there isn't a particular way to do it. I think there is a dogma on campuses, or I think generally in young people, which think that advocacy or certain allyship can only occur in a particular way. I think it's upon us to broaden the spectrum, and it's upon us to build allyship with people who value us, who value our authentic Sikh self, and if we can carry out sort of this mission of being a Sikh in sort of in a world that's very dangerous. So I think I agree with Shamsher. I think it all starts with the grassroots, and I think it's all about community power, and I think that's what this conversation was about here today. It was about community power, building community power in our gurdwaras, building it within your friend circles, building it within your wider family circles. These are all sort of units of community power, and it has to be a strong bond, and it has to be a strong brotherhood and sisterhood of being a part of the community. And I think that has to come first, and it has to transcend everything. It has to transcend your other circles you have. You might have other political circles. I think this circle of being a Panth and being a collective has to transcend all of that. And I think that the loyalty has to lie there. So I think that's what I would say. And I think it's power is about not exerting other power on others, but it's about having the ability to express yourself and having the ability to exert political power. So that's what I would say. In the words of YG, I would say stay dangerous. That's what it's about.
Yeah, so I think that just like Shamsher and Karam said, we have to start at our Panthic level and start out making sure how we best uplift the Sikh community. And if the goal is sovereignty, if the goal is to get Khalistan one day, our Desh isn't just going to fall out of the sky one day. We have to fight for it, and we have all these means presentable to us, and one of those means is politics, is getting involved in government. So obviously it might be a long shot. It's not going to be for like in the next coming years, but we have to stay at it, and we have proof, like Gurmeet Singh Aulak, he was engaged in some fashion in government and in politics, and we did get some kind of awareness out of that. But it's just a constant uphill battle, and we all have different views and different perspectives. But the main goal, as the conversation was here, is how do we uplift the Qawm, and how do we go about fighting for these causes. And I think we just have to choose which avenue best fits our life and what we're passionate about, and go about that, and the goal in mind that Sikhi always comes first.
All right, so with that, I think we come to the end of our discussion today. Thank you all so much for having this extremely engaging discussion. For those of you watching at home, if you agreed or if you disagreed, that's kind of the point of this whole thing. So make sure, sound off in the comments, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, but it's important to remember to keep things productive and keep things constructive, because I think one thing that I think all of us can agree with is, especially in online Sikh discourse, it's not exactly the most constructive of spaces. So that's kind of what the Miri Piri Project is working to change, and hopefully we've come one step closer to doing that with this discussion here today, and we can all remember that we have the same basic goals in mind, which is to continue to advance the material conditions of the Panth. So Thank you all for coming on and discussing. Thank you all at home for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And that's all. Thank you. Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.